Thanks for coming out to our third session of the Modernism, Materiality, and Meaning Conference on James Joyce, Surrealism, and the Gotham Bookmark. My name is Michael Shea. I'm a first-year PhD student here at Penn, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panel to you. This panel is sponsored by the Philadelphia Avant-Garde Studies Consortium, so before we get started, I have to say thank you to them as well. Today we're going to hear from three speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Anne Reynolds. Anne Reynolds teaches modern and contemporary art history and women's and gender studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is currently working on a book entitled In Our Time, A History of Intergenerational Relationships Among New York Artists circa 1940 to 1970 that were shaped by shared, if heterogeneous, commitments to surrealism and its legacy, primarily through a love of film. Anne will be presenting a paper entitled View Listens, A Cosmopolitan Surrealism. Our second speaker will be Matthew Affron. Matthew Affron is the Muriel and Philip Berman Curator of Modern Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Since joining the PMA in 2013, he has organized the Essential Duchamp, an exhibition from the museum's permanent collection and library and archives that is currently traveling in the Asia-Pacific region, and co-organized Paint the Revolution, Mexican Modernism 1910 to 1950. An upcoming project will focus on Henri Matisse in the 1930s. Previously, he was a faculty member in art history at the University of Virginia and also had an appointment at the university's museum. He has published and lectured on Cubism, abstract art, surrealism, and other topics in modern art. He holds MA and PhD degrees in art history from Yale University, and his paper is entitled Duchamp and the Bookshop Window. And finally, we'll hear from Paul K. Saint-Amour, who is the Walter H. and Leonore C. Annenberg Professor in the Humanities here at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of The Copyrights, Intellectual Property and Literary Imagination, and Tense Future, Modernism, Total War, Encyclopedic Form. Saint-Amour edited the collection Modernism and Copyright and co-edits with Jessica Berman the Modernist Latitudes series at Columbia University Press. His teaching and writing are now exploring questions of ethics, affect, and scale in the environmental humanities. So we're going to get started, and please welcome Anne.
I just want to let you know how pleased I am to be here, and thank you for being invited. I normally speak about this material to people who work in art history, so it's nice to have an audience that probably more than half of you have actually heard of View magazine, but maybe not. So I'm going to give some background on View magazine, and then I'm going to really speak more polemically about how I think the experience of working with the materials in the archive and the magazine itself are quite at odds with the general scholarly arguments about surrealism, so-called surrealism in America in the 40s, and how to reconcile that, which is often a problem for people who do archival research. Okay. View began, like many little magazines of the 1940s, as a poetry magazine, or to be more precise, a magazine about the arts as viewed through the eyes of the poets, which was the magazine's subtitle during the first years of its publication. View was founded in New York City by a poet, Charles Henry Ford, and a bit later he was joined by another, Parker Tyler. It was Ford's second magazine. From 1929 to 1930, he had published Blues, a magazine of new rhythms. You can see a copy of this downstairs, which included poems, short stories, and essays from an international and intergenerational roster of writers, some of them already key figures in modernist literary scenes in Paris, London, and New York. And it was Ford's second collaboration with Tyler. In 1933, they published a roman à clef entitled The Young and the Evil. This novel, based on their letters to each other, offers an experimental narrative of cocktail parties, cruising, drag balls, violent encounters, and brittle repartee that was immediately banned in the United States, but simultaneously praised by Gertrude Stein, and has had a lasting appeal as a pre-Stonewall artifact of a sexually fluid New York scene. View's very first issue appeared in September of 1940 and the magazine ran until mid-1947, outlasting many of its contemporaries. Over the course of its existence, the magazine's subtitle changed several times to reflect its ever-increasingly eclectic capaciousness. By the final issues, this subtitle consisted of a simple yet broad list: art, literature, documents, criticism, and else. The magazine was also a physical shapeshifter, as you can see on the screen, from its beginnings as a modest, roughly 8-page tabloid, which you see in the lower right, one in from the corner, to at the end, quite slick, rather thick final issues whose covers, layout, graphics, and full-page advertisements resembled more mainstream popular magazines like Life and Look. Several of View's early issues served double duty as exhibition catalogs for gallery shows of the works of contemporary artists such as Max Ernst, Yves Tanguy, and Pavel Chelychev. And I'm showing you the front and back of one issue, which is the Tanguy Chelychev issue, and the Tanguy part is reversed, so you would read to the middle and have to flip the magazine over and start again from front to back, so that it did double duty for 2 separate exhibitions. Or possessed formats and themes devised by the editors or guest editors to suit their particular interests or the diverse variety of enterprises Ford, Tyler, and other members of the magazine's inner circle were participating in during the 40s. With a penchant for the unexpected and an unerring eye for quality, View mixed fiction and poetry, political and philosophical texts, musical scores, and film art, music, and book reviews, with features on artists such as Hans Bellmer, Alexander Calder, George O'Keeffe, Joseph Cornell, Man Ray, André Masson, Juan Miro, Ferdinand Léger, René Magritte, Isamu Noguchi, and Florine Stettheimer, and many, many more that we'd be here a long time, whose commissions also often graced the covers of the magazine. View was one of the first to publish English translations of works by Raymond Roussel, Georges-Louis Borges, Benjamin Perret, Albert Camus, Henri Michaud, Jean Genet, and Jean-Paul Sartre. It was the first to publish an interview in English with the exiled surrealist André Breton. The 1945 Marcel Duchamp special issue was the first monograph on the artist and featured a highly collectible cutout collage inside. And for a special issue on theater, which would have been the last issue of the magazine but was never published, Ford hoped to include a translation of Walter Benjamin's Notes on Epic Theater, which would have yet been another first. Writers for the magazine included Paul Bowles, Kay Boyle, Maya Deren, Lawrence Durrell, Jean Genet, Paul Goodman, Lincoln Kirstein, Marshall McLuhan, Henry Miller, Marion Moore, Harold Rosenberg, Meyer Shapiro, Edith Sitwell, Dorothea Tanning, Virgil Thompson, William Carlos Williams, and again, many others. I labor over these lists just to give you some sense of the tremendous capaciousness. It's almost as if anybody who was at all anybody was published in this magazine, and as you'll see, everybody that was nobody also was published in the magazine, side by side. The magazine also organized a jazz concert bringing jazz musicians from the South in Times Hall, New York in 1944. Hosted Jean-Paul Sartre when he came to New York to lecture at Carnegie Hall in 1946. And you probably can't read that, but this is an article from the New Yorker talking about Ford and the magazine facilitating this event. They also curated exhibitions within their tiny offices, but also at the Hugo Gallery just around the corner on East 55th Street. And they published a limited series of books, including a collection of Breton's poetry entitled Young Cherry Trees Secured Against Hares, which was translated by Edward Roditi with a cover design by Marcel Duchamp and illustrations by Arshil Gorky, who Breton claimed to be his discovery. Because of the magazine's frequent formal transformations, flexible uses, and its editor's engagement with culture and politics very broadly and loosely defined, and on so many fronts, it is difficult to make sustainable or defendable generalizations about View. The magazine, however, is now remembered as a surrealist magazine, and more specifically as an American surrealist magazine. And when I say this, I need to be clear, especially being from Texas, this means North America, not America in total. This magazine is, if it's remembered, in addition to being an American surrealist magazine, the second fact that is often cited, it was briefly in competition with Breton's more European magazine, VVV, which only published 4 issues over a period of 4 years from 1942 to 44, a source of great tension for Breton that his magazine failed, whereas View continued. View did, however, put a North American spin on a surrealist sensibility, and an American one as well, meaning it did address Latin America and Central America. The editors regularly published Native American and African American poetry and poetry and artwork by U.S. soldiers stationed both in the U.S. and abroad, as well as feature articles on numerous U.S. artists, including Alvin Albright, Morris Hirschfeld, not to mention Joseph Cornell's design for the entire issue, Fantastica Americana, in 1943. I'm showing you the whole cover spread out so you can see, so it would be one continuous sheet. But this assessment of View as an American surrealist magazine, which is really the predominant one, is, I would say, at the risk of being cruel, simplistic, and retrospective. And I would argue it's a self-serving characterization of the magazine and of the aims of its editors. Even a cursory examination of almost any single issue of the magazine will reveal the fact that many exiles from Europe and elsewhere, including but not exclusively European surrealists, also contributed to View both before and after their arrival in New York. And these contributions appeared alongside images and texts by well-known and relatively unknown writers and artists from the US, some of them also living as expats in Europe and other parts of the world. To state the obvious, the war created exiles in more than one country. And many individuals living outside the United States were reading the magazine and viewing it as a cultural lifeline. There is clear evidence in the published letters and also in the archives. I'll give you just 2 letters from 1943. Quote, "Literary activity still goes on in Cambridge. England is yet far from having gone under. We send our greetings wherever they may be to the poets of America. Long live our View." And View and our are capitalized. A Royal Air Force subscriber writes from North Harrow, Middlesex, England, quote, "There are several of us at this station of the the RAF, who are extremely interested in poetry and allied subjects, so that View will be well circulated and equally well discussed, as well as deeply cherished by all of us." View's editors were particularly dedicated to providing a wide range of perspectives on and eyewitness accounts of the plight of artists and avant-garde culture throughout and after World War II through a rich variety of approaches. Special issues focused on activities in individual cities, countries or regions such as Latin America, Italy, and Belgium, and regular correspondents contributed extended letters to the magazine's section called View Listens section. These came from cities like Cairo, London, Marseille, Paris, and countries like Sweden and other places worldwide. Others wrote about their experiences as political prisoners and reviewed then current films and books about the war and its consequences, such as Anna Seger's 1942 bestseller, The Seventh Cross, and the 1944 Hollywood film based on it. These reviews and letters and articles appeared alongside letters to the editor about whether or not artists and writers should be exempted from the draft. Many of the magazine's stories, poetry, and images addressed violence, conscientious objection, and U.S. isolationism as a potential form of political narcissism, and the radical political potential of art through a wide variety of loosely surrealist-inflected metaphors and symbolism, which some readers found inappropriate during a time of war, and wrote about that. My own alternative attempt to set aside View as an American surrealist magazine, but to make some tentative generalizations, is to propose polemic debate, willful eccentricity, and ultimately a great deal of ambivalence around consensus or synthesis as consistently central, interrelated aims of View's editors and contributors. Cumulatively, the evidence of these aims points to View's particular cosmopolitan rather than provincially American surrealism as both a vital, eclectic, and often contentious literary and aesthetic network, and as a model for writing the history of this period, I would argue, and its post-war legacy in the United States. Many artists and writers growing up in the 40s and 50s read View. It was a much more accessible and continuous source of diverse information about the literary, political, and artistic avant-garde than museum exhibitions. And a lot of artists, particularly in the 60s and 70s, say just that about it. For scholars, it contains images, essays, and evidence of debates and cultural relationships across media and among individuals and groups that now seem less familiar from the point of view of the present and are rarely mentioned in more recent histories of this period. But I guess I'm most interested in the way these materials are combined and how the relationships among them were meant to be understood. What View's editors and contributors, and by extension the magazine's readers and subscribers, thought was culturally significant about the moment in which they lived. How this culture should look, both individually and collectively, and why these choices might be important to acknowledge and understand now. That seems to me the most telling thing. So I'm just going to spend the rest of my time giving you a few examples of what I mean. But first, I want to give you a definition of cosmopolitanism, because I also think that is standing in the way of thinking about this magazine as either European, these magazines as either European or American. A definition of cosmopolitanism in relation to the condition of exile and immigration in New York City during the first half of the 20th century. Individuals certainly were fleeing Europe for New York during the 1940s and earlier. But for Ford and Tyler, among many others, they had already fled America for New York almost 2 decades earlier. And I think that's something to think about. New York City, in part, is a city of exiles. They were not native New Yorkers, and no one that worked on the staff of the magazine was either. Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler were both Southerners, which I think is significant. Ford was born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi in 1908. Tyler was born in 1904 in New Orleans, Louisiana. The magazine's managing editor, starting in 1944, John Bernard Myers, was born in Buffalo, New York in 1920. He brought on Betty Cage, also from Buffalo, as the magazine secretary in 1944. Dawn Powell, herself someone who left the Midwest for New York around the same time as Tyler left Louisiana, describes this particular form of self-imposed exile in her 1938 novel, The Happy Island. And I'm going to quote, "The friends of Prudence," one of the main characters of the novel, "and the friends of Prudence's friends were born so far as each other knew, with a canapé in one hand and a dry martini in the other. Their roots, except for the documented Europeans, flung back to covered wagons, mining camps, village pool rooms, lonely farms on the prairie. But these parts were snapped off like admission coupons at the gates of the great city. Where had they met? On transatlantic steamers, in a star's dressing room, at a dinner. For each other, the past began where the previous years were mere nourishment to the plant. The twisted underground roots were forgotten by the gay blossom. Their Americanness was left at the door, was the price of entry." Some viewed these New York coteries of exiles, as I'm calling them, without a past, as comprising distinct social cliques. This is how the critic Clement Greenberg, a native New Yorker, described View magazine itself in a 1941 review of Little magazines in Partisan Review. He called it a group of surrealists that identifies literature and art with social life, and that this social life is complicated and satisfying. The gossip is good if you know the names. If you know the people, I imagine it might get to be a little too much. Sometimes it is even a little too much for people like me, plain strangers," end quote. He goes on to despair that through all this frivolous socializing, little magazines like View have lost touch with politics and need to make decisions, need to take sides to be relevant, need to be clear. Tyler countered in a letter to the editor, "Mr. G may be plain to some of these people, but he is certainly no stranger to them." Mr. Greenberg was friendly to at least one name constantly in View, the undersigned. Such criticism, Tyler states, betrays social responsibility and are lacking in a general sense of critical proportions and personal honesty. Others, such as a reviewer for the New Republic, describe the general atmosphere of View as definitely mauve. But such false distinctions that these critics are making among social groups, that they are distinct. Greenberg also goes on to claim a few years later that, quote, "we are all living in the nightmare of a homosexual world in New York." Distract from the qualities of the mixing and passing as, the messy way in which things came together in the magazine and in everyday life, particularly during the war. Unlike curators who have had to deal with the obdurate physical differences between individual objects when arranging them in space, magazine editors during this time could use design and reproductive technologies to level the playing field in a particular way. View's editors embrace these opportunities. Even as it evolved from the simple newspaper format used for its first 3 issues to the, as I said, glossy, quite commercial-looking issues, in its final years, size and quality of image rarely conformed to any type of consistent or familiar hierarchy. In other words, just because you're a famous artist doesn't mean you get a big image. Pages from typesetters' manuals were reproduced as double-page spreads and as poetry, while paintings would sometimes appear as small, almost thumbnail black and white images. The same was true of the types of writing and authors the editors chose to publish. Texts by well-known authors from a relatively broad variety of literary, political, and artistic worlds, locations, and generations sat alongside stories, poems, and letters by children, young soldiers, inmates, incarcerated people, and wives of opticians. And the editors did little to call attention to these juxtapositions. If anything, they used size, color, and typography to suggest continuity and equivalence. For example, an article written from prison by an inmate about making do as an artist with materials at hand appears in the same issue as an article about Florian Stettheimer in the same font, layout, and roughly equivalent length, one preceding the other in the magazine. What might this suggest about View's aims? Exile, cosmopolitanism, is always both jarring and assimilating at once. I just want to leave you with a quotation, which is a total anachronism, but it has helped me a lot to think about this relationship among exile, cosmopolitanism, and the way the magazine looks. And it's from Edward Said, an essay, a very famous essay by Edward Said called Reflections on Exile. He says, "For an exile, habits of life, expressions, or activity in the new environment inevitably occur against the memory of these things in another environment. Both the new and the old environments are vivid, actually occurring together, contrapunctually. There is a unique pleasure in this sort of apprehension, especially if the exile is conscious of other contrapuntal juxtapositions that diminish orthodox judgment and elevate appreciative sympathy. There is also a particular sense of achievement in acting as if one were at home wherever one happens to be." Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank David McKnight and his colleagues at the Penn Library for the invitation to take part in this panel. And I'm very happy that I'm going to be presenting some material that really is going to lead right from where we just were in the last talk. I also want to say that I wish everybody could sit in the front row because the images are going to be less easy to make out than it might have been, but we'll just keep going anyway. I'll start with a famous photograph of a window display that was presented at the Gotham Bookmark on West 47th Street in New York during a single week in April 1945. Maya Deren, the American experimental filmmaker, was commissioned to make a series of views, and that's one of them. I'll show you some others. This display promoted new publications by or about two leading lights of the Surrealist exile group in wartime New York, the poet André Breton and the artist Marcel Duchamp. Breton's book that was being displayed was Arcanum 17, which is a book with elements of the essay, the prose poem, and the confessional narrative. To compose this work, Breton, who had escaped from France for New York, retreated for 3 months to the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, and there he found some solace in a wild and isolated region. Also a place where they were still speaking a language related to a language from the Channel Islands, so linguistically isolated place as well. And he wrote a book which was also inspired by themes of magic and alchemy. Its title, Arcanum 17, refers to the 17th major arcanum of the tarot, the star card, which Breton used as a hopeful symbol of love in his own life and resurrection and renewal in world affairs. And I'm going to look here because I'm showing you a slide with a view of the cover of the book and the title page with frontispiece and another item which I'll describe in a second. The Brentano's Bookstore had released Arcanum 17 under its own imprint in March. The luxury edition had images by Roberto Matta, a young Chilean-born surrealist with links to Breton for some years already, including, facing the title page, an etching signed and numbered, showing one of Matta's recognizable figures, a halfling figure, with humanoid, animal, insectoid qualities. And the luxury edition also came with 4 cards designed by Matta, photolithographs, not etchings, which were his reworkings of hieroglyphic tarot imagery, including there, the 17th card of the tarot, which shows a young woman pouring love and intelligence from 2 urns onto the earth under the morning star. Back to the shop window. For use in the window display, Matta also made a tall advertising poster in ink, colored pencil, opaque watercolor, charcoal, and pasted paper on cardboard, there and here. It shows a couple of his bestial figures, male and female, embracing in a fantastic landscape. Just below, and this you really cannot see, is one of those cards. I was just talking about the 17th one, the tarot card by Matta with the morning star. Nearby, to make a connection, the Swiss-French sculptor Isabelle Wahlberg contributed an inkwell in the form of a starfish with a feather in it, and the feather connects to imagery of seabirds in Breton's texts. Now, some version of that window display had been planned and was initially executed for the Brentano's headquarters near the corner of 47th and 5th Avenue, logically because they were the publisher. But after complaints from the public, almost immediately was taken down and then reconstituted a little farther down 47th Street at Gotham at the suggestion of Charles Henry Ford, the editor of View magazine, who we've been hearing about. What happened next, as told actually in View Listens in May, and then in the middle of the month, and later by Frances Stelloff in her memoir of the Gotham Bookshop, Stelloff has a visit from the leader of a morality watchdog group that campaigned against literature it deemed to be indecent. This is the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and it's this is the This is the Brentano shop window here on 47th. This is the insignia of the New York Society for Suppression of Vice, with a lovely image of a man throwing books onto a burning pyre. And this slide is a detail of another photograph by Maya Deren of the shop window as it was reconstituted at Gotham's, showing the solution to the complaint. Stelloff applied a covering mark censored over the offending item in the window, which was the exposed female breast of the insectoid figure in Matta's poster. And you see it there. The display, we're told, stayed on a full week and drew larger crowds than it had before. Marcel Duchamp's contributions to the window apparently did not figure in that controversy, but they were crucial features of the window display nonetheless. The eye-catching figure at the center, this view anyway, at the center of the window was his, a female display mannequin, headless, naked, except for a white maid's apron, holding copies of Breton's book in her arms. And they are here. Also related to Duchamp are items here on the other side of the starfish inkwell here, a copy of View magazine and some items associated with the imagery in that copy, recently published by View, an issue devoted entirely to the life and work of Marcel Duchamp himself. All right. Here another view by Maya Deren showing Duchamp in action as a window dresser at the Gotham Bookshop, working on the mannequin and actually seeming to affix a a very phallic faucet to her exposed thigh. In order to start talking about Duchamp's contributions to this window and how they connect to him and to the story, I'm going to first talk about the mannequin, and then I'm going to eventually get to the view issue, which was also on display in the window. This photograph gives you an important clue because there's an inscription from Duchamp himself. He signs it and dates it New York, 1945, in the lower left-hand corner. It's a fragment of a strange phrase that reads in full in English translation, although he wrote it in French, and the phrase in full reads, "Among our articles of lazy hardware, we recommend the faucet that stops running when no one is listening to it," close quote. The phrase had a history. Duchamp had invented it some 20 years before, and he invoked it here to make a connection to connect this project and the mannequin in the window to some of his own past artistic activities. So very self-referential in a way that is not unfamiliar for Duchamp. I hope you'll bear with me now as I run frantically through some earlier key moments to bring us back to 1945 and try to give a framing for what he did in the Gotham window in 45. Duchamp, of course, had started out as an avant-garde painter. He made his first real mark in the art world as a member of the Cubist group in Paris around 1910, 1911. And he had his first taste of public notoriety when a picture entitled Nude Descending a Staircase No. 2 was exhibited to some scandal at the Epical Armory Show in New York in 1913. Right after that, Duchamp took a momentous decision. This is when he was still only 25 years old, and that was to abandon painting as both a craft and a profession. He had lost faith in traditional oil painting as a vehicle for his ideas. He also looked askance now at the institutional system of modern art, the system within which artistic careers were set up and sustained, the world of artists, artist groups, critics, commercial galleries, and the market, and so on. And so he cheerfully became defrocked as a painter and made it his business to carve out a different presence in the art world where he hoped he would operate with independence and freedom. And I think that this is a very important sort of background for what we're talking about, which is the project of 45. That decision led to the Keystone Worker of his early career, which is the work that's illustrated on the left-hand side of the screen. And now I'm making a little advertising for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I work, and where you can go look at these things in the flesh. I look forward to seeing you there. The Keystone Worker of his early career, the work entitled The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even of 1915 to 23, a work known more familiarly as The Large Glass. Among other things, The Large Glass on the left was a great experiment in the construction of an image using both traditional and unusual materials on a transparent window-like glass surface that was enclosed in a metal frame standing more than 9 feet high. At the same time, in tandem with the large glass, he came up with maybe his most famous invention, the ready-mades. These were ordinary manufactured objects that gained unexpected meanings when Duchamp put them in artistic context and sometimes added written inscriptions to aid in their intellectual reframing. Because Duchamp had not made, and I'm giving you the example of a later replica of the first ready-made, the so-called bicycle wheel, 1913 originally, because Duchamp had not made them by hand, and since they were mass-produced or made from mass-produced components, the ready-made stood as an antidote to the issues that bothered him about the art game as it was normally played, in which he had just recently tried to escape. The ready-made seemed to work against the deification of the personality of the artist. They parodied the market as an arbiter of quality. They displaced the very definition of the work of art from where it had been. Now, moving forward in my forced march through history here, to get closer to the main topic, because it's a little magazine of the avant-garde, here's a famous image of a work that Duchamp had formulated in 1919, a time when he was in line with the avant-garde Dada movement in both Paris and New York. The famous LHOQ, the doctored, cheap reproduction of the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, to which he added a mustache and a goatee and an ironic caption. Duchamp, in his person and his work, exemplified the Dada group's basic stance of a more or less rebellion against bourgeois and middle-of-the-road values and beliefs. And this Mona Lisa was an icon of the moment, this defacement of the Mona Lisa, because it so beautifully expressed the avant-garde complaint against the old values of timeless beauty, psychological mystery, and the awe of art. In 1920, Duchamp's sidekick, the artist Francis Picabia, made his own version with the mustache before getting the goatee and published it on the cover of a little magazine published in New York called 391. This moment was also the moment, and now I'm really getting closer to our topic, I promise you, when Duchamp, in search of a creative way to decenter his own identity as an artist, invented an ambiguously male and female persona named Eros c'est la vie, and then went on to develop many new artistic projects using that name and signature. Initially, Eros had two specialties. One was wordplay, aphorisms, puns, tongue twisters, games that associated words from their ordinary usages, spoonerisms, usually playing on the sexual connotations of words. The other specialty was in the line of optical illusion machines, contraptions that read as parodies of modern engineering and precision optical instrumentation, but also advanced Duchamp's long-term preoccupation with relations between the sensory and the cerebral. Because the illusions they generated, though they came in through the eyes, really existed only in the mind. These activities came together in anemic cinema, the short avant-garde film, classic avant-garde film. You're seeing some frames on the screen, composed of alternating shots of rotating discs, 9 discs with spiraling sentences that unspool at a reader's pace, and 10 with graphic spirals that appear to pulse forward and backwards in space. The words, if read aloud, produced repetitive patterns of sounds, and they also generated surprising associations of ideas, often scatological or obscene. What you have in anemic cinema is coded language plus pulsating abstract forms equals thoughts relating to sex in the mind of the viewer. Duchamp explained that he liked to place eroticism at the center of his work and deploy it in a spirit of rebellious humor and against social norms and conventions, but he also used eroticism much more coldly as a kind of structure on which to hang his very abstruse aesthetic speculations. Anemic cinema, and you're seeing the frame here, was the source of the sentence that Duchamp later would partially inscribe in the corner of that photograph of himself addressing the mannequin at Gotham's. So that was the origin. That sentence had more than one life. In 1939, a small literary anthology in Paris, a small literary press in Paris brought out an anthology of 42 puns and word games by Marcel Duchamp / Eros c'est la vie, and that same sentence was published there, and that it's in that red box. But the point I'm really getting to is that by the midpoint of the 30s, Eros c'est la vie had added a third specialty to wordplay and optics, and that was having become a publisher in her own right. Duchamp had become very involved with the idea of books and albums as creative formats. A key example is the so-called Green Box, which you're seeing on the screen. It's dated 1934, published in Paris. This was a compilation of 94 documents. Some of them are in that view with the green container in which they were all held. That's in the right side screen there. 94 documents all relating to the genesis of the large glass, the summa of his early career. These documents include manuscript notes that Duchamp had written back in 1912 or so in different inks, often on scraps of paper with irregular edges, as well as drawings and plans and photographs of the work. All these documents are presented haphazardly with no order, no fixed order in the box as a sort of puzzle about the ideas of the large glass and in no way a conventional guide. They were housed in this specially, as I say, designed cardboard box covered with green flocking. It's worth stressing that the green box documents were, for the most part, and this is very important, facsimile reproductions, not original documents, though Duchamp put great effort to producing those facsimiles. He worked with a Paris printing company to make the reproductions using collotype, which is a photomechanical process that offered very high fidelity in the reproduction of tone and tint. He selected his paper stocks carefully to match the original papers of his notes and so forth. He matched the original inks. He made zinc templates to guide the tearing of the irregular edges of the little scraps of paper that he had written on before, originally. He published this in an edition of 300 with 20 luxury copies, each containing one of the original notes or documents for collectors with a special interest in his work. To sell the edition, and that's what you're seeing on the left, Duchamp issued a printed order form that directed subscribers to mail their checks to Eros et la Vie's publisher, care of Marcel Duchamp's bank in Paris. 1935, Duchamp gave a copy of the Green Box to Michel Leiris, the surrealist writer and ethnographer. Leiris, who'd been following Eros et la Vie's career for about 10 years, wrote a very insightful review in a literary journal. What interested Leiris was Duchamp's fanatical attachment to exactitude in the technical realization of the Green Box, which he interpreted as Duchamp's determination to avoid dressing up or deifying the notes and documents. In other words, for Leiris, though Duchamp was acting like the publisher of a luxury artist's book, of a sort that usually gets made with a restricted public of connoisseurs and collectors in mind, that was only one part of the story, because his use of a mechanical reproduction technique in a spirit quite foreign to what everybody thought of as the usual boundaries of fine art printmaking opened up new values for art. Even more interestingly, from that point onward, Duchamp began to make more and more intensive use of book and magazine design as a creative medium. And now you see where I'm going. Just three examples very quickly. On the left, the Cahiers d'Art, a luxury art magazine in Paris, with Duchamp's version of a classic optical illusion called Fluttering Hearts, when an image of superimposed red and blue hearts is moved side to side under dim light, you're supposed to see a subtle flutter or wobble, optical illusion. On the left, the literary and art magazine Transition, with cover by Duchamp replicating one of his early ready-mades. And in the center, the front and back covers of a Parisian magazine, also art literary magazine, small magazine called Aube, with a reproduction of one of the drawings for one of the motifs in the large glass. Okay, moving forward now. Duchamp escaped France for New York in June 1942, where he joined Breton, his old friend and artistic collaborator in the Cosmopolitan international community of wartime emigres in New York, and publishing projects continued apace. He soon joined the editorial board of the short-lived New York surrealist journal Triple V, and he contributed designs to 2 issues, which interestingly evoked public and political concerns to a degree that was unprecedented for the usually non-political Duchamp, though still very open-ended in the way they addressed those concerns. On the left, you have issue number 2 of Triple V from March 43, with a cover featuring an old relief print that Duchamp found. Maybe it's a rider on a horse with a scythe, an hourglass, a long beard, a kind of Father Time, sort of, also an acrobat, superimposed over the world. Maybe Duchamp was attracted by the fact that the jacket of this acrobat, Father Time, has a stars and stripes motif. And inside another issue of Triple V in February 1944, reproduction of his work called Genre Allegory, a image with multiple meanings, which reads simultaneously as the right profile of George Washington, the father of the country, and an image of the United States, sort of a map of the U.S., with Latin America sort of turned sideways with Mexico on the left and Canada on the right. And also red in terms of the stars and stripes, because you have the color of the red, white, and blue with embossed stars. But those red streaks were problematic for some because they also suggested bloodied fabric. That image, which was then printed with a complicated system of a kind of a baffle over another image and so forth. In other words, a complicated printing and binding experiment. The image had been commissioned and then refused by Vogue magazine because the content was too troubling, but it found a home at Triple V. In March 1945, View, sympathetic to surrealism but more broadly involved with the avant-garde in New York, produced an issue devoted entirely to Duchamp, and that's the issue that was sort of displayed as the other part of the Duchamp material in the Gotham window. this magazine, and you're seeing the front and back covers both by Duchamp, was a signal of his high standing in the New York avant-garde. And his fingerprints were all over it. He helped to assemble the table of contents, gather the texts. He did the visual design and layout. He did the front cover, which was an entirely new rendering of key motifs from a large glass, an undertaking so complicated that it earned a special note located on the table of contents, interpreting its imagery, but also highlighting that cover image as some kind of tour de force of halftone printing. Not to mention a photographic collage. Duchamp had worked with a New York photographer named Percy Rainford to assemble the underlying photographic elements. Okay. Breton contributed a testimonial statement about his friend for this issue called Testimonial 45. In it, he alluded to Duchamp's legendary detachment from the art game. Quote, I say that Marcel Duchamp's journey through the artistic looking glass, he italicizes that phrase, determines a fundamental crisis of painting and sculpture. As examples of that crisis which Duchamp was producing, Breton pointed to various recent projects, including the covers for VVV and The View magazine. And it was a very short step from there to finally our topic, which is the design of bookstore display windows. And there were several. In 1942, Brentanos published a book called The Devil's Share by Denis de Rougemont, the Swiss-born writer and critic who was also living in exile in New York, a meditation on the nature of evil, both historical and modern, with references to folklore and theology and high culture and mass culture and Hitler and the democracies that opposed him. Brentanos commissioned a window from Breton, Duchamp, and Kurt Seligmann, the Swiss-born painter and printmaker. Seligmann, who was known for his interest in the occult, painted some diabolic emblems, old ones, on the back white surface. Above, you can't see it well, Duchamp created a kind of false ceiling of open umbrellas hanging from their handles, and then some devil statues borrowed from an antiques dealer were put elsewhere in the window. In his journal, Rougemont likened Duchamp's umbrellas to the wings of giant bats. He also said a story about a passerby who saw the window, reacted strongly, and jeered at the display as if to drive the devil back. Next came lazy hardware, and just to underline it, there's a detail of the mannequin with the faucet on her thigh that I described before. An element of gender doubling fully in line with what Duchamp had done before, a visual pun matching the sentence among our articles of lazy hardware. We recommend the faucet that stops running when no one's listening to it. More or less at the same moment, in 1945, back to Brentanos, brought out a revised, expanded edition of a book originally published in 1928 in Paris, Breton's Surrealism and Painting. Duchamp was again fully involved. He planned the binding, the typography, the method of printing a painting by René Magritte on the cover, and then working with Enrico Donati, who was a younger American surrealist, designed for Brentanos a window containing various elements, some relating directly to the book and some not so much, and bringing once again Isabel Wahlberg, the sculptor who had made the starfish inkwell in the window over at Gotham's. These three examples raise a question. Why, and I'm going to go towards my conclusion with it, why would Duchamp have found the bookshop window to be an interesting creative format? To answer that, I'll take the lead of those who study the institutions of literary modernism, people like Andrew Thacker, who I know spoke in this conference. He's described the bookshop as a space of interaction, a space between culture and commerce, a space where artists, writers, publishers, and the public can come together. I think it's pretty clear that the bookshop window appealed to Duchamp's long-term ways of working, his desire to work outside the boundaries of the traditional fine arts, his experiments in authorial self-presentation in relation to the public, his innovative use of the techniques of publishing. All of that is there. I'll close with two final points. First, the Gotham Bookmark window was an artifact of a very specific time and place, New York's cosmopolitan avant-garde during World War II. This snapshot of 1945 shows a social gathering at a French restaurant 1 block from Gotham, more or less, on 46th Street, late in that year, 1945, when Mata and Duchamp and other friends gathered to bid Breton farewell as he prepared to finally leave New York to go back to France. And that I think helps to sort of set the stage for the specific moment that the Gotham window stands for. But as a final point, it did have a sequel, this Gotham bookshop window. This is a photograph from February 1960. Grove Press had just brought out the English language edition of Robert Lebel's Marcel Duchamp, a monograph for the preliminary catalog of the artist's works. As usual, Duchamp supervised the book's layout. He also created a special container for the deluxe edition. The publisher started looking for a place to make a display to celebrate the book. Bamberger's, then a prominent department store chain on the East Coast, commissioned Duchamp to make a 2-week display for its flagship store in Newark. And he followed the old pattern. What else could he do? He mixed together his own artworks with some of his optical toys, other printed things, and an eye-catching, or actually five, I think, eye-catching mannequins. Nude Descending a Staircase, the Cubist painting that had made his name decades ago, first in New York, 50 years before practically, is visible in the upper corner of the window at Bamberger's, but not the famous second version, which everybody knows. Instead, the Philadelphia Museum of Art loaned Nude Descending Staircase number 3, which is a full-sized, hand-retouched copy of the painting that Duchamp had made for his patrons, Walter and Louise Ahrensburg, in 1916, a very early instance of his creative exploration of the gap between original works and copies. And in addition to the other materials in the window, at Duchamp's request, the department store provided 5 armless naked store mannequins. He set them up so that they could continue the downward trajectory of the nude in the picture within the space of the shop window. Have you guessed what happened next in this 2-week display at Bamberger's in Newark? 2 days later, the Grove Press, the publicity person at Grove Press, gets a call from Newark saying that the public is outraged by the nudity of the mannequins, and Marcel Duchamp gets on the train, is called back to Newark to take down his display. Thank you very much.
I'm Paul. I'm the Joyce part of Joyce and Surrealism. I'm going to go fast because I know we don't really have a buffer between this panel and the next one, so I hope you'll understand if I skip some things and maybe come screeching to a kind of arbitrary halt. I'm grateful to David McKnight for inviting me to dip a toe in the Joyce materials in the GBM collection. Because as is often the case, you're least aware of the thing that's right under your nose, or at least in my case, right across the street, because I teach in the English department here at Penn. And so I'm a real latecomer to the GBM materials, and I'm not someone who typically works in material text studies. But it's been a real joy to spend a little bit of time, really just kind of a first pass with some of the Joyce material. And I have very much felt the kind of gravitational pull of this collection, both as a researcher and as a teacher. So I know I'll be coming back and hopefully bringing students. Just a brief note on the title of this talk. I liked his Gothamm, Gothamm. Of course, with Finnegan's Wake, you never quite know how to pronounce things. But this is I liked his Gothamm Chic as a moment on 538, page 538 of the Wake, when I think Joyce may be referring to the Gotham bookstore. because if you think about Frances Steloff, right, the chick from Gotham, she'd have had to have had a lot of goddamn cheek to stock obscene books like Ulysses during the 1920s and 30s. And there are a couple of other moments on this page. So there's that I like the Gothamm chic moment, but references in the same area to buy Bibles and Manhattan, and also to a poet, Dante Gaudi and Shopkeeper. So we have literary greats Dante, Goethe, and Shakespeare rendered into the language of Victorian commerce. So it feels like we're in some kind of nation of shopkeepers bookstore environment there. I'm not really going to be making an argument here because, again, this is a first pass at some materials, but I do think that the Joyce materials that I've seen are a wonderful kind of cross-section of a process of recognition, dissemination, canonization, and institutionalization that literary scholars like me don't often enough think is happening in booksellers. So I'm taking very seriously Andrew's and Lisa's suggestion that we need to pay more attention to bookstores. And 1940, in a way, is going to be a fulcrum in this sped-up talk. The vast majority of the images that I'll show you are from the collection, and I'll flag the ones that are not. There's not much in the collection to do with the early sale of Ulysses in the 20s and 30s. A few things like this extract from early reviews. This is not in the collection, the big blue book, the first Shakespeare and Company edition of Ulysses. But I thought I would show you this, since Andrew mentioned it yesterday, the Dragnet's fake copy in which Ulysses was smuggled into the US for people like Frances Steloff to sell it at the Gotham book market. Here's an order form by which you could order a copy of Finnegan's Wake from the London publisher, but by way of Gotham Bookmark. So already by this point, Steloff had been stocking Transition, had been the sort of US distributor for the magazine Transition, in which parts of Joyce's work in progress had been appearing. So she's now a distribution point for Finnegan's Wake. And it stands to reason then that there would be a big party, one of her favorites, to celebrate the publication of the Wake on May 4th, 1939. So in the collection, there are several copies of RSVP cards, like this one, signed by a patron I don't recognize. But the dead come to life at Finnegan's Wake, who confidentially will be the life of the party on May 4th. The painting there is by Ruth Bauer, and we'll be re-encountering it in a second. Here are just a couple of pictures of Steloff in costume as the widow Finnegan, on the left seated, and on the right with a glass of Guinness in her hand, I assume. And there's the painting there. She had done some research by asking James Gilvery, an Irish Joycean, what one needed at an Irish wake. And so one of the lovely holdings here is the actual receipt for the clay pipes and tobacco that were brought in from Ireland so that people could smoke at the wake, which they're doing in photographs of the event. Here's just, the whiskey was also imported. It was Bushmills. So nothing was spared for authenticity's sake. On the flip side of that receipt, though, is just this lovely little moment, candles $1.30, plants $10, beer, sandwiches, etc., where you're reminded that these famous moments in literary history were also just a day passing in the life of somebody who was trying to remember errands that they would immediately thereafter forget. And it's that texture of everyday life coinciding with literary history that I think is so bewitching about a lot of these kinds of materials. The following year, in 1940, and by this point, the wake is circulating. Joyce has been sent photographs of the party and has signaled his approval. The Gotham Bookmark is celebrating its 20th anniversary, and they decide to go all out with a catalog that Steloff really considered her kind of crowning achievement as a bookseller. So we see on the cover of We Moderns that image from the Wake for the Wake. But I think what's fascinating about this is that instead of just providing a list of what was for sale. Steloff has the authors included in We Moderns kind of selecting one another and also striking one another off of the list, right? If some of the people on the list were deemed insufficiently experimental, and then introducing one another, right? So Martha Foley writes on Eugene Jolas. Jolas introduces Joyce. Carl van Vechten introduces Gertrude Stein, and Stein introduces Paris because Stein wouldn't play by this kind of back massage train rule. But in a way, what we have here is a kind of informally peer-reviewed canon of modernism in the US happening. And those of us who teach literary modernism in English departments are used to thinking about Axel's Castle by Edmund Wilson, which is published in 1931, or about Harry Levin's essay, What Was Modernism, which is from the 60s, as these kind of crucial moments of canon formation. But here in 1940, right, as the war is beginning to carry away some of the participants in that Gotham world, we have this moment where the writers themselves, in communication with Steloff, are producing a kind of canon, peer reviewing it, excluding, including, suggesting one another. And we really need to think in our kind of longitudinal stories about modernism about what a moment like this signifies and how our stories would change if we were to take it seriously. And also to think about how We Moderns would have worked differently if it had been called The Nuts, which was apparently a possible title because these many of these writers were referred to informally as the Nuts or the eccentrics by members of that circle. Just because I can't resist, or maybe, I don't know if this is going to work. Let's see here. You could pick up a copy of the first edition of Ulysses for a cool $65, and this was on Verge d'Arche paper, so it was one of the more elite versions. And in the Joyce holdings, you see all of these first editions, early appearances of work in progress of the early work. So at this point in 1940, the Gotham Bookmark really is a place that you can go to get rare and early materials for what seems now like a pitiably small amount of money. There was a pastoral element to the Gotham Bookmark, which I've come to appreciate by looking at these materials. So in 1941, after Joyce's death, the Bookmark publishes a very short book called Pastimes of James Joyce, which includes this etching, but also facsimiles of some occasional works of his, a poem about Thanksgiving, who knew, and a kind of prosodic breakdown. And all proceeds were sent to the Joyce family, who were living in Zurich on a very slender income. Because the Joyce estate was financially quartered in England, and apparently it was very difficult to get money out of England in 1941. So if you bought a $5 copy of this Pastimes of James Joyce, it would be sent directly to Nora Joyce. Jumping forward a decade to 1960, here's a catalog devoted just to works by and about Joyce. And you can see the number of sort of early and rare materials starting to thin out. Although you can still get a 1922 first edition on Dutch-made handmade paper signed, so that's the most kind of elite edition of Ulysses that was available when it was published by Shakespeare and Company for $385. But other kind of canon forming and institutionalizing moves are starting to happen. So you have a list of Joyce influences, which is both writers influenced by Joyce and writers who influenced Joyce. So in effect, the Bookshop is doing the literary historical work now of locating Joyce within genealogies of influence. And this is, to suggest that despite the kind of diminution of the bookseller that Andrew was talking about, right, in 1960, there still is a kind of quasi-historicizing and academic function happening at a place like the Gotham Bookmark. Not least, I think, because William York Tyndall, a Joycean who was at Columbia, had sort of been pulled in to be the unofficial in-house Joycean at the Bookmark. So I think we see his hands here. Interesting, too, that at this point, the pirated editions of Ulysses by Samuel Roth in Two Worlds, Two Worlds Monthly, and then the pirated editions of Work in Progress from the Two Worlds Journal were thought to be collectible enough to be sold for significant amounts of money, right? So even a kind of blacklisted figure like Roth now is becoming a figure of literary interest. And this is really for J.C. Cloutier, but in these materials you come across names like Adelaide Roth Kugel in address stickers. This is Samuel Roth's daughter, who was an invitee to Gotham Bookmark things. So Roth was on the one hand this kind of bête noire figure of modernism for pirating Ulysses and not paying Joyce. On the other hand, he was still selling soft porn books that he was publishing through the Bookmark, and his daughter is attending events, right? So it can be very difficult to locate individuals in a kind of fixed place in these ever-shifting constellations. This is another catalog from, I think, the early to mid-70s, in which, by which time the number of Joyce holdings for sale is very small. But because of the networks in which the Bookmark was still very much moving, here we see the copies belonging to the critic Edmund Wilson, whom I mentioned a little while ago, for sale. Wilson's annotated copies of Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and I think most movingly of Rudyard Kipling's Actions and Reactions, which had clearly belonged to him when he was a child, a school child. So Wilson died in 1972. I think what has happened here is that one of his survivors has sold all or part of his library through the Bookmark. And I think one could trace the fate of some of these works, and be very interesting to do. Here again in the early 70s, interesting to think about the difference between our modernism and modernism in 1972. So Steinbeck is here, but not Virginia Woolf, right? And if you go back to We Moderns, it's very interesting to see what women writers are in that circle. So H.D., Juna Barnes, Dorothy Richardson, and of course Gertrude Stein are not Woolf, no mention of Woolf, not Hope Mirrlees, not Mina Loy. And of course, the Harlem Renaissance writers are nowhere to be seen. So again, if we think about this as a kind of stratigraphic cut in the canonization and institutionalization of modernism, we see both some very familiar material and some quite alien notions of what modernism was. There's more than one moment in a work's reception, of course. So the Wake Party happens in 1939. In 1947, the Bookmark becomes the site of the James Joyce Society's meeting, and Steloff is the treasurer. And so for a minimum of 4 times a year, the James Joyce Society would meet to talk about Joyce's work. One of the most devout attendees of the James Joyce Society in these days was an experimental abstract filmmaker named Mary Ellen Butte, who always sat in the front row when Finnegan's Wake was being talked about. She's a fascinating figure, and my hope in just the next couple of minutes is to infect you with a little curiosity about her. In 1958, she goes to Barnard and sees an all-female student production of a stage adaptation of Finnegan's Wake, which has been written by Mary Manning. So the two Marys, Joyce would have loved it. Mary Manning, an actor, herself an actress, and also a filmmaker, and writer for the stage. The program here is from the debut of that adaptation at the Poets Theatre in Cambridge, Mass. But here it's being done at Barnard, in an all-female cast. Mary Ellen Butte thinks, I've got to do this. We need to bring this to off-Broadway. But oddly enough, another Joyce adaptation by a woman, Marjorie Bardington's adaptation of the Circe episode of Ulysses in Nighttown, is also seeking funding at the same time. So 1958 is a year in which 2 different Joyce adaptations by women are kind of colliding in New York. And it's Ulysses in Nighttown which kind of gets the first thumbs up. Zero Mostel, if you can believe it, plays Leopold Bloom, and would come to the Joyce Society and try out some of his big speeches. So Mary Ellen Butte decides, forget it, we're going to do a film. And 7 years later, starts to pull this film together. In the collection is a complete film script of passages from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, the film that she finally makes. And it's fascinating to see how carefully that film script is keyed to the pages and lines in the Wake itself. when the film is shown, it is dedicated to Frances Steloff. So this is a film, again, by the two Marys, right? And Frances Steloff is a kind of third informal participant. And if you think about the number of women who were indispensable to Joyce's works making its way, right, from Heap and Anderson to Sylvia Beach to Harriet Shaw Weaver to Mrs. Harold McCormick to Nora Joyce herself, it's fascinating to think that even after Joyce's death, he has these crucial women figures, artists themselves, who are adapting his work, fighting for it, deeply committed to his work. And that's true in the case of this film of Finnegans Wake, which, when it's finally released in 1967, comes out the same year as Joseph Strick's film of Ulysses. So again, imagine a year in which there are competing adaptations of Joyce's major works, in theaters. But the Wake film is a great success and garners a lot of critical raves. And here is Frances Steloff with Parrot Column and with Mary Ellen Butte. And if you're interested at all in this film, there's quite a lot of ephemera in the collection, the Gotham Bookmark collection, pertaining to the film. I think because Steloff was so invested in it, although she doesn't talk much about it in her memoir, and she never refers to the fact that the film was dedicated to her. I don't know whether out of modesty or some other inclination. Okay, just to wrap quickly, I want to just recommend a book that is also in this collection. That was a Gotham Bookmark publication. So we're going back in time a little bit to 1947. Leon Edel, whom if you've heard of, you probably know as the biographer of Henry James, right? But in 1945, Edel is in the armed forces, and he's in Europe after the war, and he makes a pilgrimage to Joyce's grave in Zurich. And he's wearing his insignia, and he writes about the effect that seeing his U.S. Army insignia has on the Swiss in the tram on the way to the Flintern Cemetery. He writes very movingly about how small the headstone looks and how simple, and how remarkable it is that such a great writer could be contained in such a small space. It's a very short book, but I recommend it to you, not least because after seeing Joyce, Edel then meets up with Nora Joyce, and she tells him the story of their flight from France, first from Paris into Vichy territory, Saint-Germain-le-Puy, and then out of France into Zurich, into Switzerland, and then of Joyce's final days in which he's dying of peritonitis from a perforated duodenal ulcer. And that city of exile is his story of his dinner with Nora, at the end of which he realizes that he has the last chapter of an unwritten biography of Joyce. And so the third section, The Last Journey, is actually his attempt to write this kind of counterfactual chapter to a non-existent biography of Joyce that he himself is not going to write. And there's something about the series of missed rendezvous here, right? He doesn't get to meet Joyce, even though he was educated in Paris during the time Joyce was there. Steloff also visited Paris while Joyce was living there and never got to meet him. There's the sense at the grave that Edel has missed his rendezvous with Joyce, and he's also missed his rendezvous with Joyce's life as a biographer because he's already been infected with the James virus, and that's going to direct the course of his life. But I think for those of us who, like me, missed our rendezvous with Steloff and the GBM in their original sites, the collections becoming available at Penn really is proof that the appointments you miss are the only ones that you have any chance in the long run of keeping. Thanks very much.
So one of the things that I was thinking about during all of these talks, which were so wonderful, is that there's this underlying structure of the GBM, or of these sort of spaces that are somewhere in between commerce and culture, as Matthew pointed out, the little magazines. And we're now almost 80 years after the first issue of View. We're 75 after the Duchamp Windows, and we're in the era of Amazon.com. And so I guess I would be interested to hear each of you speak about where the energies fostered by this structure, or these sort of structures and communities, has gone. Is that something that's disappeared? Is it translated somewhere else? Is it something that can be revived with different institutions?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer, especially as a historian. But
All I can say is I teach a class on View. It's called Magazine as Archive with undergraduates at the Harry Ransom Center. And my undergraduates always say to me at some point in the semester that these people are so much more interesting and so much more cool than they'll ever be that they have no idea how to cope. I mean, they say some version of that, and some of them actually stop, cancel their Instagram account. I mean, they start making, so I guess I'm having a kind of an anachronistic effect on my students. So I can't, I'm sort of answering your question backwards, but that's been my experience.
I think your question is sort of about what people used to call the third space. Is that right? Yeah. You know, when Borders Books was still around and had a cafe, and you know, you'd see teenagers sprawled for hours with their laptops, with their headphones, doing their homework, and the defense of that was, you know, well, we need a sort of third space in addition to the public sphere and the private sphere, this sort of semi-public sphere. Maybe where some version of the bookstore owner as friend could happen, although Borders is a very different version of that than the Gotham Bookmart. I have to think that, like, we don't have three spaces anymore, and that we kind of need to rethink the geometry of public and private and the something else, because clearly that third space is sort of shattered and happening among a lot of different kinds of social media. A lot of it is online. And you know, for good and ill, right? And to sort of sit back and try to think about what the ramifications of that shattering of the third space might be, I think would be very interesting.
I think it's a daunting question also, but I would agree and say that, you know, the internet in the most hopeful account might actually start to bear some fruits later. If things like archives and other kinds of repositories of material that isn't so easily available to so many people all the time start sending stuff out in ways that people can engage with, something good could come, right? So I have no idea where that space is, and
it's probably not spatial.
It's probably not spatial, and I'm definitely too old to ever inhabit it. But you know, one can always hope.
May I add something to this?
Please.
I'm thinking of the fantasies that libraries have these days, of removing books to far-flung depositories, if they need them at all, making space for wonderful sofas and couches and areas where one can sit down, and even glass pavilions where one can meet and have snacks in the lobby outside. That is perhaps not the way libraries were a few decades ago. And there is a kind of odd situation here. Libraries are definitely not supposed to be commercial, although we are looking out for donors and all kinds of other things. On the other hand, libraries are supposed to be silent. And I'm not speaking about this room here in particular, but about the rooms outside with the sofas where you have to meet, sit down, but then just look onto your iPhone or laptop and not each other. So it is not just a question of space, but the question of the kind of communication and the question of how the relationship of commercial and public, non-commercial, has shifted in odd ways.
Anyone would like to follow Liliana's comment? We can go.
I think I'll add a little more optimistic note here. First of all, I highly recommend everybody in Philadelphia, or if you're not and visiting, visit the Ulysses bookstore in Fishtown. I don't know how many of you have been there, but it is named after Ulysses Carrion, the important Mexican modernist who went to Amsterdam and created an incredible bookstore with performances and exhibitions, which you can find at Ulysses too. So please go.
May I just add something? This is not an ordinary bookstore.
I'm
It was founded by ICA members with a public grant, so it's extremely fragile. It cannot live from the economy the bookseller has.
Yeah.
So again, we have this problem of public-private, of who is financing what.
Well, I don't, you don't want to hear a debate from me, but I'm one of the supporters of Ulysses, and I've written about it. And really, there is this notion that we have to free ourselves of, that something must always continue. And Ulysses Carrion did not believe things must always continue, and in fact, he eventually left his bookstore, believed in communication by airmail, and there are now archives in Santander, Spain, of his materials and related materials. So I do hope you all support Ulysses. It was founded near the Crane Art Center by the guy who runs the Crane Art Center, and it wasn't founded by him. He founded a big space, which artist studio, and he also had this garage. And he said, I can't get around to repurposing that yet. Would you like to use it as a bookstore, performance center, et cetera? So it was never meant to be a permanent phenomenon. It's gone on past its own life, but it's still there. And by the way, in New Jersey, they now have a publishing establishment, but that's more than you needed to know about Ulysses. But I actually believe that the internet, and I hate to use the name because it's got a bad connotation among many, and Jeff Bezos have done more toward creating the availability of books of all sorts, a book market valuing books, than, or at least as much as what the old timers like Sylvia Beach did. So I would say that we have more, I know that we now have more independent bookstores than we did before Amazon.com. We have lost the big chains, but we have more independent bookstores. And I would just embrace the fact that it's always intimidating to young people about when they learn about something old. Oh my God, how am I ever going to be able to do that? But I think there's another view, which is that it's exciting out there. New stuff is happening all over the place. So I've spoken more than I should have, but anyway.
Your comment about Amazon makes me think about Lisa's talking about dark archives, because, you know, for all I think the ways in which Amazon has stimulated reading, you know, it's virtually impossible to get any kind of access to their archives. I know this is not your point, but I think Mark McGurl, who wrote The Program Era, is finishing a book about Amazon and self-publishing. But one of the complaints of that book is basically that we have no access to probably the single richest database for understanding the literary present. And that as long as that archive is dark, in a way, we're kind of groping in that dark for a light switch through which to kind of understand our world.
Remind me where your hands are. I'll come around.
Time for maybe like one more.
I just wanted to add to that point that the former, now quite former, director of the New York Public Library, a person named David Stamm, has commented, I'm not sure whether he said anything about this in print, but that the problem of independently published books is something that is exacerbated by libraries' reluctance to buy and catalog them, so that you don't have any way of accessing the large majority of them through standard scholarly means of accessing those books. That said, I want to make one other comment, which is just based on old age, if you will forgive me for being blunt about it. But I'm wondering about the extent to which the kind of activities that the three of you have spoken about and that others have spoken about this morning and last night, characteristic of bookstores, particularly during the 30s and 40s, wasn't also a reflection of a certain kind of political, not simply economic attitude. And my sense, having grown up in New York in a post-1940s environment, is that the kinds of things that I'm looking at when I see your store windows from Brentano's are very, very far from the Brentano's or the Scribner's store fronts that I remember, and that not until the very end of the 50s did you begin to see things like Eli Willins's 8th Street bookstore become even remotely like the sort of bookstore spaces that you're talking about, with huge and influential sections of psychology and Jungianism, huge and very interesting collections of what were then new trade paperbacks. Jason Epstein's, the first G that I ever got as a kid was an Anchor paperback at the 8th Street bookstore. And there was a real trough during the 50s. And I wonder if one of the things that people aren't suggesting, as we've just been listening to, is sort of a resurgence of that kind of energy.
Thanks, Dan.
I just want to sort of take this in a slightly diagonal direction by suggesting that a lot of what is happening presently is happening in ways that we don't yet recognize. I will give you a very concrete example within 200 yards of here, I believe, maybe 500 yards. And that's Kelly's Writer's House, which I think is much more important for the student population and for the community population than it is for, say, Penn faculty like myself, although I teach in the place. The really great disappearance beyond bookstores, and hearing what this woman was saying reminded me that 2 of the 3 great bookstores in Berkeley, Cody's and Shakespeare and Company, both have gone belly up, since Jeff Bezos showed up. In those terms, and noting how important in the 60s and 70s, when the language poets who were my cohort were getting together, coffee houses were, and how the sterility of Starbucks has in no way replicated that or carried it forward. But I see a place like Writer's House with the kind of activities that go on there, and it reminds me of my days when I was working as an ethnographer as to what they use and what they don't use. I mean, there's a lot of, I think, mythology about the importance of the green couch, quite literally, in the alcove, which has not left or been cleaned in at least 15 years. And which I don't really see people do much with except sleep. But the kitchen at Kelly Writer's House is by far the most important space in that entire building for the students. And there are so many conversations going on there, and they are so animated. And it reminds me that, in many ways, modernism began because Charles Doolittle, who was just about the first science professor at Penn, had Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams as students of his in a chemistry class, and his daughter was Hilda Doolittle. And so they were following him home after class and meeting his daughter. And, you know, a lot came out of that. So I would take a look at those kinds of sites and both what they do intentionally and what they do unintentionally. You know, if I had the money to endow something at Penn, it would be the kitchen at Kelly Writer's house.
Would you like to endow a kitchen at the Penn Book Center and maybe here at Van Pelt? I mean, in a way, your description of the Kelly Writer's house, I think, speaks to an interest in sort of opening up and also domesticating institutional spaces, harder institutional spaces like libraries. And for all that I'm attached to the sort of monastic silence and the dusty stacks and the serendipities of browsing that I think, Liliana, you were invoking for us. You know, libraries have probably always been changing as institutions, and I think we have to allow them to be dynamic even as we try to preserve some of those functions. And B, they've always been dependent on economics, right? And as is the Kelly Writer's house. I mean, none of the institutions we've been talking about are exempt from markets. And so in some sense, you know, a library that you know, wears its donors and its cafes on its sleeve is in a way being open about its enmeshment within market society that was always there, right? And is arguably dispensing with the fiction that any of these institutions exist outside of markets for good or ill.
And I also think we need to think about how we use these spaces. We actually be more activists using these spaces. I mean, one of the things that I've experienced having undergraduates work with research materials is that there were lots and lots of rules when I first started it, and in fact staff standing behind each of my students, and they basically had to tolerate that. And the more we just kept coming back and asking, well, what's this room that seems to just have a lot of brooms in it? What can we do? And like starting to repurpose the space and retake it and use it in different kinds of ways. I think that's really important. So I think there's new spaces, but there's also rethinking and re-owning old spaces. So.
Great. Well, we're going to move into the next panel, but of course these conversations can continue. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists.